February 12th, 1945. Near the Elbe River, northern Germany. The cold came first, not suddenly, not dramatically. It crept in slowly, the way hopelessness does, through the boots, through the seams of our coats, into the bones. Minus 28 degrees Celsius. The kind of cold that makes sound feel sharp. The kind that turns breath into something visible, fragile, and easily stolen by the wind. I remember thinking that if I stopped moving, even for a moment, I would simply harden. Like the trees around us. Like the bodies we had already passed on the road during the retreat. We had been walking for days. Nurses, auxiliaries, girls barely old enough to remember a world before war. No proper coats, no food left. Our field hospital had vanished behind us. First the doctors, then the trucks, then the wounded we could not carry. In the end, there was only snow, forest, and the sound of our own breathing growing weaker. When the American patrol found us, we were huddled inside the remains of a barn, or what had once been one. A roof half collapsed, walls cracked open to the wind, straw frozen into hard yellow sheets beneath our knees. No one screamed. No one ran. We didn't have the strength. I remember tightening my fingers around the edge of my sleeve, trying to keep what little warmth remained from escaping. My hands were blue. I could no longer feel my toes. Somewhere behind me, someone whispered a prayer. Someone else whispered a curse. I did not pray. I was too tired to hope. We had been taught what capture meant. We had heard the stories. Beaten prisoners, starvation, humiliation. We had prepared ourselves for cruelty because cruelty made sense. Cruelty fit the war we knew. So when the boots appeared at the doorway of the barn, dark shapes against the white, I lowered my eyes. This was it, I thought. I waited for shouting, for the crack of rifle butts, for the cold to finally finish its work. Instead, I smelled coffee. At first, I thought my mind had broken. It was faint, almost insulting in its familiarity. Warm, bitter, real. The kind of smell that belonged to kitchens, not battlefields, to mornings, not endings. I lifted my head slowly, afraid the movement itself might cost me what little balance I had left. The Americans stood there, steam rising from their coats as they breathed. Their faces were red from the cold, their scarves pulled high. One of them, the one in front, said something I didn't understand. His voice was calm, almost gentle. No one hit us. No one shouted. I noticed the sound next. Metal tapping against metal. Not weapons. Something lighter. Rhythmic. The kind of sound pots make when they touch each other. Then came another sound. A hiss. Soft. Steady. Like water moving through pipes. Hot water. The thought felt absurd. Dangerous. Why would there be hot water here? The soldier in front, later I would learn his name was Tommy, looked at us the way one looks at something fragile already, cracked. His eyes moved from face to face, from bare hands wrapped in rags to boots stuffed with paper. He said something again, slower this time. I caught one word. Cold. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. Behind him, another soldier was already unrolling something from his pack. A blanket, thick, wool, American. He hesitated only a second before stepping forward and draping it around the shoulders of the girl beside me. She gasped, not loudly, just enough to betray the shock of warmth touching skin that had almost forgotten what warmth was. Then another blanket appeared, and another. Someone took off his own coat. Someone else untied a scarf and pressed it into trembling hands. No orders, no speeches, just movement. I wanted to pull away. Every instinct told me not to accept it. That kindness, when offered by an enemy, always came with a price. But my body betrayed me. When the blanket touched my back, my knees buckled. The warmth did not feel gentle. It hurt, sharp and sudden like needles under the skin. I bit my lip to keep from crying out. I had promised myself I would not cry in front of them. The soldier steadied me without thinking, his gloved hand firm at my elbow. He smelled faintly of soap, pine, maybe, and smoke. Cigarettes. "Easy," he said. I understood that word. Easy. They lifted us next. One by one, not dragged, not pushed. Lifted, fireman's carry, piggyback, arms around shoulders. I remember staring at the snow as it passed beneath me, the world swaying with each step, and thinking that this must be a dream my body was inventing to make dying easier. Then the smell came again, stronger now. Bread. Fresh bread, not the sour gray rations we had known for months. This was different. Warm. Yeasty. Alive. Steam rose from somewhere ahead, curling into the frozen air like something that refused to be afraid of the cold. We reached the field kitchen just as the sky began to lighten, that pale, exhausted gray that comes before morning in winter. A large man in an apron looked up as we were carried in. His face changed when he saw us. Not with anger, not with disgust, but with something that looked dangerously close to sorrow. "Soup's on," he said loudly. Then, after a pause, "Double portions." The word soup landed inside me like a blow. Soup meant heat. Soup meant survival. Soup meant tomorrow. They sat us down on ammunition crates near the stove. The metal was warm. I pressed my palms against it, afraid the feeling would vanish if I did not anchor myself to it somehow. A mess tin was placed into my hands. It was full. Steam rose from the surface, carrying the smell of chicken, vegetables, fat, real fat, and something green I could not name. For a moment, no one moved. We were prisoners. But the first thing we were given was not a command. It was food. I lifted the spoon. My hand shook so badly the soup rippled. I did not know yet what this moment would mean. I only knew one thing, with a certainty that frightened me more than the cold ever had. This was not how it was supposed to begin, and somewhere deep inside, a question I had not allowed myself to ask since the war began finally surfaced, trembling and impossible to ignore. If this is America, then what else have we been wrong about? We were trained to expect pain. I did not drink the soup right away. I held the tin bowl in both hands and waited. Steam rose from the surface, fogging my eyelashes, warming my cheeks, and still I waited, my body tense, my shoulders drawn inward as if bracing for a blow that had not yet come. This was how fear worked now. It no longer arrived with shouting or violence. It lived in memory, in habit, in what we had been taught to expect. In Germany, fear had been explained to us long before we ever met an American soldier. I remembered the lectures, the long rooms with wooden benches, the maps on the walls, Europe colored in bold certainty. The instructors spoke calmly, confidently, the way people do when they want you to stop thinking for yourself. They told us who the enemy was. They told us what would happen if we were captured. The Americans are soft on the outside, they said, but cruel when it matters. They humiliate prisoners. They starve them. They enjoy watching the enemy break. We were warned not to trust kindness. Kindness, they said, was only a tool, a way to lower your guard before the real punishment began. So, when the soup came, my first thought was not gratitude. It was suspicion. I watched the Americans from beneath my lashes as they moved around the kitchen. They laughed quietly among themselves. One stirred a pot. Another tore bread apart with bare hands, the crust cracking loudly in the warm air. It felt wrong, too ordinary. War was not supposed to sound like this. I took a careful sip, barely enough to wet my lips. The heat shocked me. It spread through my mouth, down my throat, into my chest like something alive. I swallowed hard, my breath catching despite myself. Nothing happened. No one laughed, no one shouted, no one pulled the bowl away. Still, I did not eat more. Around me, I could see the same hesitation mirrored on other faces. One woman stared at her bread without touching it, as if waiting for a signal. Another held her spoon frozen halfway between bowl and mouth, her knuckles white. We were afraid of being watched, afraid of being tested, afraid that the moment we surrendered to hunger, the rules would change. Fear had trained us well. It had trained us to believe that pain was inevitable, that cruelty was the natural order of things, that survival always came with a cost, and the cost was dignity. As I sat there, the warmth seeping slowly into my bones, my mind drifted backward, not to safety, but to ruins, to Germany as it had become, cities reduced to outlines, streets where buildings had once stood, now only piles of brick and twisted iron, the smell of smoke that never quite left the air, the sound of sirens at night growing so familiar that sleep learned to live around them. I thought of Munich, of the apartment where my mother had once set bread on the table every morning. I had not heard from her in months. Letters stopped arriving. Trains stopped running. Names disappeared into lists that no one explained. We told ourselves it was temporary. We told ourselves it was necessary. But as the war dragged on, those words lost their shape. The world had shrunk. It became hunger, cold, endless retreat. By the time we reached the barn near the Elbe, the idea of after no longer made sense. There was only now, and now was unbearable. That was why capture felt like an ending, not a beginning. I had expected violence because violence would have been familiar. I had expected punishment because punishment fit the story we had been living. What I had not expected was this quiet pause, this strange moment where nothing bad seemed to happen. That uncertainty frightened me more than cruelty ever could. I took another sip. This time I swallowed without flinching. The soup tasted real. Chicken, carrots, salt. Not too much, not too little. Someone had made this with the intention that it would be eaten, enjoyed, finished. I felt my eyes sting. I lowered my head quickly, ashamed of the weakness, and focused on the bowl. The metal was warm now. I pressed it closer to my chest, letting the heat seep through the thin fabric of my uniform. Across from me, one of the Americans caught my eye. He looked away immediately as if he had not meant to stare. There was no triumph in his expression, no curiosity, just concern. That confused me. If we were trophies, he did not look proud. If we were enemies, he did not look satisfied. He looked like a man watching someone stand too close to a fire, afraid they might get burned. I thought again of what we had been told, that Americans lacked discipline, that they relied on comfort, that they were careless, indulgent, morally weak. And yet here they were, organized, efficient, calm. Their kitchen ran smoothly despite the chaos beyond its canvas walls. Their movements were practiced, purposeful. This was not softness, this was control. Outside the tent, I could still hear the wind cutting through the trees. The war had not stopped. Somewhere beyond the forest, guns were firing, cities were still burning, families were still being broken apart. Europe was collapsing under its own weight. And yet, inside this small pocket of warmth, there was order, heat, food, a refusal to let the cold win, even for those who had been taught to deserve it. The contrast was unbearable. I realized then that my fear was no longer about what they might do to us. It was about what their kindness might mean. Because if this was real, if this was not a trick, then everything we had been told was incomplete. Or worse, wrong. I set the bowl down and forced myself to look up again. The Americans were still there, still moving, still doing nothing that matched the warnings carved into my mind. Slowly, carefully, as if approaching something sacred, I lifted the spoon and took a proper mouthful. This time, I did not stop myself from crying. Not because I was afraid, but because, for the first time since the war began, I felt something even more dangerous than fear rising inside me. Hope. And hope, I knew, was the most terrifying thing of all, because it had something to lose. Hope did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, like the warmth from the soup, slow, almost suspicious, something you only noticed after it had already begun to change you. I was still afraid. That was the part no one ever understands later. Kindness does not erase fear immediately. Sometimes it makes it worse, because fear knows how to survive pain. It does not know how to survive gentleness. I kept waiting for the moment when the rules would shift, for the bowl to be taken away, for a voice to rise, for the warmth to come with conditions. Instead, nothing happened. The Americans moved around us with an awkward carefulness, as if we were something that might shatter if handled too roughly. They did not bark orders, they did not ask questions, they did not demand gratitude. They simply kept doing small things. One of them noticed my hands. I had not realized how badly they were shaking until he crouched down in front of me. He did not touch me at first. He just watched for a second, as if asking permission without words. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a pair of gloves. They were too big. Thick wool, American issued. He hesitated. I could see it in the way his fingers tightened around them. Then he placed them gently in my lap and looked away. No explanation, no smile. Just a nod, as if to say, "Use them." I stared at the gloves for a long moment before daring to slide my hands inside. The wool scratched my skin. It felt solid, real, like something meant to last. My fingers stopped shaking. Across the tent, another soldier was doing the same thing, taking off his own coat and draping it over the shoulders of a girl whose lips had turned an alarming shade of blue. She flinched when the fabric touched her neck, then sagged against the crate she was sitting on, her breath leaving her in a single, broken sound. No one told her to be calm. No one told her to sit up straight. They let her be weak. That, more than anything, confused me. In Germany, weakness had been something to correct, to discipline, to harden away. We had learned to hide it even from ourselves. Here, no one seemed offended by it. One of the Americans tried to speak to us again. His accent was thick, his German careful and clumsy, as if each word had to be lifted separately before being placed on the air. "Warm," he said, pointing to the stove. "Safe." He searched my face, uncertain, then gave up and shrugged slightly, the way people do when language fails them. That shrug stayed with me. It was not careless. It was human. I noticed then how young they were. Some no older than my brother would have been. Their faces carried the same exhaustion as ours, the same hollow eyes, the same lines carved too early by cold and sleepless nights. These were not men who had been spared by the war. They had simply come from somewhere else. As the minutes passed, the Americans kept moving, refilling bowls, tearing bread, pushing the stove just a little closer to where we sat. Someone adjusted the flap of the tent to block the wind. Another laid out more blankets without being asked. Still no speeches. Still no rules. I began to realize something unsettling. This was not charity born from excess emotion. It was routine. They knew how to do this. That frightened me more than if they had made a show of it. I thought of what America must look like beyond this frozen pocket of forest, of the factories I had heard about, places that never slept, where machines ran day and night, turning steel into tanks, planes, trucks, of women in trousers and bandanas standing at assembly lines, hands blackened with grease, building the tools of war while their sons and husbands fought overseas. I had seen the posters before the bombing became too heavy. Rosie, the riveter, flexing her arm. We can do it. They could do it because they had to. And because they could, there was food here. Enough food to feed enemies. There were blankets here. Enough to spare from their own backs. Strength, I realized, was not just about destruction. It was about margin. The ability to give without collapsing. The ability to look at an enemy freezing in the snow and decide that there was still room for decency. One of the soldiers, the one called Tommy, sat down across from me. Not too close, not too far. He rested his elbows on his knees and watched to make sure I was eating. When I paused, overwhelmed by the heat spreading through my body, he held up a finger gently, as if to say slowly. He mimed drinking, then breathing out. "Easy," he said again. I did as he showed me. Outside, the wind howled, impatient and relentless. Inside, time slowed. Someone laughed. One of the Americans, startled by something stupid and small. The sound felt out of place like a note played in the wrong key. Then another joined in, softer. Soon the kitchen hummed with low conversation, metal clinking, the steady scrape of spoons against tin. No one paid attention to us crying. That was another kindness. They did not ask us to be grateful. They did not ask us to perform relief for them. They allowed us to fall apart privately, in pieces. As the warmth settled deeper, I felt my thoughts begin to drift. Not backward into ruins, but sideways, toward questions I had not allowed myself to ask. If these men were monsters, they were very bad at it. If this was manipulation, it was expensive and inefficient. I watched one soldier tear his bread in half and hand the larger piece to a girl beside me without comment. She stared at it, then at him, her mouth opening slightly in disbelief. He just shrugged. Again, that shrug. As if the act required no justification. As if generosity were not an exception, but a default. For the first time since the war began, I felt something inside me crack. Not break, not collapse, but open. Just a little. Enough for a thin line of light to slip through. I did not trust it yet. I did not know what it meant. But as I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, feeling the weight of it settle like an anchor against the cold, one thought surfaced uninvited and refused to leave. If this is how they treat enemies. I did not finish the sentence. I wasn't ready. But somewhere, beneath the fear and the suspicion and the habits drilled into me by years of war, a dangerous realization began to form. Kindness, when repeated, was not an accident. It was a choice. And America, it seemed, was strong enough to make it. Even here, even now, even for us. The soup broke us. I did not realize when the moment changed. There was no sound to mark it, no signal, no dramatic turn. It happened quietly, the way things truly important always do. One moment, I was still watching the Americans carefully, my body tense beneath the blanket, my thoughts sharp with suspicion. The next, my hands were wrapped around the bowl, and I could no longer stop them from shaking. Not from cold, from something else. The soup sat heavy and warm in my palms. I tilted it slightly, just enough to let the surface move. Steam rose again, soft and patient, brushing my face like breath. I brought it closer, not to drink, but to feel it. The heat seeped through the thin metal into my fingers, into my wrists, climbing slowly up my arms as if it were searching for places to settle. My shoulders dropped without my permission. My jaw loosened. A sound escaped my throat before I could stop it. Not a sob, not a cry, but something broken and unrecognizable. I froze, mortified, but no one looked at me. That was when I understood I was allowed to fall apart. I took a sip. This time, I did not stop myself. The soup flooded my mouth, thick, rich, undeniably real. There were pieces of chicken I could chew, soft vegetables that still had shape, salt that made my tongue ache in a way that felt almost pleasurable after months of tasteless hunger. I swallowed. Then again. The heat traveled downward, spreading through my chest, my stomach, my legs. Places that had felt hollow and numb for so long I had forgotten they belonged to me. My eyes blurred. I lowered my head quickly, ashamed of the tears, and focused on the bowl, gripping it harder as if it might float away if I loosened my hold. Around me, the same quiet collapse was happening. One woman pressed her face close to the steam and breathed in deeply, her shoulders trembling. Another wrapped both arms around her bowl and did not drink at all. She just sat there, holding it, letting the warmth soak into her palms. Someone else tore off a piece of bread and slipped it into her coat pocket, glancing around guiltily as if expecting to be caught. Old habits, survival habits. I understood them too well. I took my bread and broke it in half, the crust cracking loudly in the warm air. Butter had been spread thick across the surface. Too thick. Wastefully thick. As I lifted it, the butter began to melt, turning glossy, dripping slowly into the cracks. I stared at it, mesmerized. Butter was not supposed to melt like this anymore. Not in winter. Not in wartime. I hesitated, then took a small bite. It tasted obscene. Rich. Soft. Real. I chewed carefully, deliberately, afraid that if I ate too fast, someone would notice and take it away. Afraid that this moment would be corrected, like a mistake. Across the crate from me, a girl began to cry. She tried to hide it, pressing her lips together, turning her face toward the tent wall. But the sound escaped anyway. A thin, shaking breath that broke and reformed and broke again. No one told her to stop. No one mocked her. One of the Americans glanced over, then deliberately looked away, giving her the privacy to shatter. That, more than the food, undid me. I felt something tear loose inside my chest, something I had been holding together with sheer force of will since the first sirens had sounded years ago. I thought of the nights without heat, the mornings without food, the way hunger had made us smaller, quieter, sharper edged. I thought of the faces we had left behind on the road, the wounded we could not carry, the civilians we passed without stopping because stopping meant dying too. I thought of how many times I had told myself, "This is what it means to survive." And now, here I was, a prisoner, sitting in a warm tent, eating better food than I had seen in months, wrapped in an American blanket that still smelled faintly of soap and smoke. The contradiction was too much. If this was deception, it was extravagant. If this was cruelty, it was poorly designed. I took another sip, my hands steady now, and asked myself the question that had been circling my thoughts since the first bowl had been placed in my hands. If this is a lie, why does it cost them so much? The soup was not thin. The bread was not stale. The butter was real. Sugar sat in a small tin near the coffee pot. White, granular, unmistakable. One of the Americans spooned it into a cup and stirred, the metal clinking softly against ceramic. Sugar. I watched the grains disappear and felt my throat tighten. We had not seen sugar in years. The man took a sip, grimaced at the heat, and laughed quietly at himself. Then, without comment, he set the cup down near one of the women who was shivering hardest. She stared at it, terrified. He pushed it a little closer with 2 fingers and stepped back. Still no explanation. Still no demand. The coffee smelled dark and bitter and sweet all at once. Steam rose from the cup, curling lazily, unconcerned with the war outside. The woman lifted it with both hands, her fingers wrapped around the porcelain as if it were something holy. She took a careful sip, then another, larger this time. Her knees buckled. She covered her mouth quickly, but the sob burst through anyway. Raw, animal, unstoppable. That was when it spread. Not like panic, like release. One by one, the sounds emerged. Quiet crying, hitching breaths, hands pressed against faces. No screaming, no wailing, just the sound of bodies finally admitting what they had endured. I felt my own tears spill over then, hot and humiliating. I did not bother to wipe them away. I was tired of being strong. I wrapped both arms around the bowl and held it against my chest, letting the heat soak through the fabric of my uniform. I leaned forward slightly, rocking without realizing it, the way one does when words are no longer useful. I did not know how long we sat like that. Time felt strange inside the tent. The war seemed far away, muffled by canvas and steam and the soft clatter of spoons. At some point I noticed that the Americans had stopped moving so much. They worked quietly now, deliberately turning their backs, lowering their voices, giving us space to come undone without being witnessed too closely. That restraint felt intentional, respectful. I caught my reflection briefly in the polished curve of the bowl. My face flushed from the heat, eyes red, hair matted beneath my cap. I did not look like a soldier. I looked like a person. The thought startled me. Had I forgotten what that felt like? I finished the soup slowly, deliberately, savoring each swallow, afraid it would be the last. When the bowl was empty, I did not hand it back right away. I held it for a few more seconds, letting the residual warmth linger. Someone placed another blanket around my shoulders. I had not noticed when the first one slipped. I did not flinch this time. I leaned into it. My body, traitorous and grateful, accepted the weight without question. I looked up then, really looked, at the Americans, at their tired faces, their cracked hands, the mud still caked on their boots. These were not men untouched by suffering. They had simply chosen, for this moment, to interrupt it. I understood something then, with a clarity that hurt. The war had taught us that cruelty was efficient, but this deliberate, costly kindness was something else entirely. It was an act of defiance. Outside, the cold still waited. The guns still fired. The world was still breaking. But inside that tent, wrapped in borrowed wool, warmed by soup that should not have been ours, we broke first. Not because we were weak, but because for the first time in a very long while, we were safe enough to do so. Kindness repeated becomes truth. He thought the kindness would end in the morning. That was the rule of war I understood. Nothing gentle lasted. Warmth was borrowed. Food was temporary. Mercy came once, if at all, and then the world corrected itself. So when I fell asleep that night, wrapped in a blanket that was not mine, my stomach full in a way that felt almost dangerous, I did not let myself believe it meant anything more than survival. I told myself to remember the taste of the soup, just in case. I woke to the sound of metal. Not gunfire, not shouting. Metal, tapping metal, a steady, familiar rhythm. Pots. Lids. Someone humming softly, off-key, as if unaware they were doing it. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I felt the blanket. Heavy. Wool. Warm. I sat up slowly, afraid the movement would break the illusion. The tent was still there. The stove still glowed faintly in the early light. Steam curled upward as water heated again. Morning had come, and with it, the Americans. They moved through the kitchen as if this were any other day, as if feeding enemies after a night of war required no special courage. Someone ladled soup into bowls. Someone else sliced bread. A crate of blankets sat open, the lid propped back casually, inviting use. No one announced anything. No one gathered us for instructions. Breakfast simply happened. That was when something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make fear hesitate. They brought the bowls to us again, full again, still hot. The bread was fresh. The butter was still there, soft and pale, melting at the edges. I waited, watching for signs of impatience, for the tightening of jaws, for the moment when generosity grew thin. It didn't come. We ate slowly, more confidently this time. The crying had stopped, replaced by silence. Not the tense silence of fear, but the heavy quiet of people who are relearning how to exist. After the meal, they did not rush us out. They brought more blankets. One soldier noticed a girl rubbing her feet against the crate, wincing slightly. He disappeared for a moment and returned with socks. Clean. Dry. He set them beside her and walked away before she could speak. She stared at them for a long time before pulling them on, her hands shaking again, not from cold, but from disbelief. This happened again and again. Not once. Every day. Each morning, soup. Each afternoon, bread. Each night, blankets tucked more carefully around shoulders that no longer recoiled at the touch. The repetition mattered. It began to teach us something our minds resisted, but our bodies understood. This was not an accident. This was how they lived. I started to notice the Americans more closely then, not as captors, not even as saviors, but as people. They talked while they worked, about small things, ordinary things. One complained about the cold, shaking his head and muttering that winter back home didn't bite like this. Another laughed and said he'd take this over mud any day. They spoke about food, not the kind in front of us, but food remembered. My ma makes stew thicker than that, one said, nodding at the pot. You can stand a spoon up in it. Another answered, Sunday dinners, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, whole house smells like it for hours. Someone mentioned a farm, cornfields that stretched farther than the eye could see, cows that knew the sound of his boots. He talked about waking before dawn, about hands numb from work even before the war had taught them other kinds of numbness. They talked about mothers a lot, about letters that arrived late or not at all, about recipes remembered more clearly than faces now blurred by time and distance, about kitchens with windows that fogged up just like this one, only safer. Listening to them felt dangerous. Their words painted pictures too close to my own memories, of my mother's hands, of a table set for meals that no longer existed, of a world where the future extended beyond the next day. I began to understand why their kindness felt so steady. It came from somewhere practiced. At night, they checked on us quietly, adjusting blankets, making sure the stove did not die down too far. One of them, Tommy, brought me an extra mug of something warm and motioned for me to drink. Sleep, he said simply. I did. For the first time in months, my dreams did not involve running. Days passed, we gained strength, our faces softened. Color returned where the cold had stolen it. Frostbite healed slowly, carefully tended by hands that did not rush. The Americans never congratulated themselves for this. They never spoke of rules or conventions. They did not tell us what they were owed. They just kept showing up. The kitchen became a place of routine, and routine, I realized, was a form of mercy. It told the body what to expect. It allowed the mind to rest. I began helping where I could, peeling potatoes, rinsing bowls. At first, I asked with my eyes, then with gestures, eventually with words. The Americans did not stop me. One of them tried to teach me English as we worked. Simple words: warm, safe, home. I taught him German in return. He struggled with the sounds, laughed at himself, tried again. Laughter returned to the tent. Not loud, not careless, but real. In quiet moments, I watched the Americans eat. Their portions were not extravagant. They took no more than they needed. They did not hoard. They did not rush. They trusted that there would be more tomorrow. That trust stunned me. It spoke of a country that could plan beyond the present hour, a place where factories ran through the night, where trains delivered food instead of evacuating civilians, where abundance had been built not for comfort alone, but for endurance. America, I realized, had prepared for this war differently. Not just with weapons, but with capacity. The capacity to feed soldiers. The capacity to clothe them. The capacity, astonishingly, to extend that care to prisoners. That strength radiated outward in small, almost invisible ways. In an extra blanket, in a second, ladle of soup, in the refusal to look away when someone was cold. I thought of Europe then, of cities hollowed out, of people scrambling for scraps, of a world reduced to survival alone. And here, in the middle of it all, these men behaved as if decency were not a luxury, but a duty. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cold began its slow return, Tommy sat near the stove and rubbed his hands together. "Winter back home," he said, searching for the words in German. "My ma, she worries." He smiled faintly. "Always worries." I understood that kind of worry. It crossed borders easily. That night, as I wrapped myself more confidently in the blanket, my blanket now, in the way shared things become yours, I realized that fear no longer dominated my thoughts. It was still there, but it had been joined by something stronger. Evidence. Evidence that kindness, when repeated, stopped being suspicious. It became truth, and as the days continued, each one unremarkable, each one quietly generous, a realization settled into me with the same steady warmth as the soup. If this was how America treated its enemies in the worst winter of the war, then perhaps the world I had been taught to fear was not the only one that existed. They didn't save me because I was German. It took me days to say it out loud, not because the thought was complicated, but because it was dangerous. Realizations like this change things. They do not simply add knowledge, they rearrange the ground beneath your feet. Once they arrive, you cannot unsee them. You cannot return to the world as it was before. The moment came quietly, as all true awakenings do. I was standing near the kitchen tent, peeling potatoes with a borrowed knife. My hands no longer shook the way they had on that first night. The skin on my fingers was cracked, still healing, but I could feel again, properly feel, the weight of the blade, the smoothness of the potato skin. Across from me, Tommy was arguing gently with another soldier about whether the stove needed more wood. They were both tired, both stubborn, neither angry. The argument ended not with victory, but with laughter. And suddenly, without warning, the thought surfaced. Clear, simple, undeniable. They didn't save me because I was German. I stopped peeling. The knife hovered uselessly in my hand as I let the idea settle, turning it slowly, examining it from every angle as if it might cut me if I was careless. They didn't save me because I was an enemy either. That, I realized, was the more important part. They had not rescued us to make a point. They had not fed us to prove superiority. They had not wrapped us in blankets to earn gratitude or obedience. They had done it because we were cold, because we were hungry, because we were there. The simplicity of it frightened me. For so long, the world had been divided cleanly. Friend and enemy, worthy and unworthy, human and less than human. We had been taught to sort people quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. But here, in this frozen corner of a collapsing continent, that system did not seem to apply. No one had asked for our papers. No one had asked for our loyalties. No one had asked who we had voted for, believed in, or marched beneath. The Americans had looked at us and seen something else entirely. Need. I remembered the first night again, the way the blanket had been placed around my shoulders, careful and unceremonious, the way the soup had been served without ceremony, without warning. No one had said, "You deserve this." No one had said, "You are forgiven." They had simply acted. And that, I realized, was the most unsettling thing of all, because action like that did not require agreement. It required capacity. America, in that moment, had possessed the strength to choose decency without hesitation, not because it was easy, but because it was possible. I began to see the pattern then, stretching beyond the tent, beyond the kitchen, beyond even the men in front of me. I thought of the stories they had told, of factories running through the night, of women standing shoulder to shoulder at assembly lines, of farms producing more than ever before, of trains moving relentlessly across vast distances. This was a country that had built itself to endure strain, to absorb shock, to give without immediately collapsing, and because of that, it could afford a certain kind of morality, one rooted not in words, but in margins. Margins of food, margins of warmth, margins of patience. That kind of strength, I realized, was invisible unless you needed it. Europe at that moment had none. Everything here had been reduced to necessity. There was no excess, no room for softness, no tolerance for inefficiency. Compassion had become a liability. But America, far away, untouched by bombing, unified by purpose, had prepared differently, not perfectly, not without cost, but deliberately. And here, at the edge of the winter and war, the preparation expressed itself not as power, but as restraint. I asked Tommy one evening, as we sat near the stove and watched the light fade, why they treated us the way they did. He thought about it longer than I expected. Then he shrugged. "Mama," he said, "she'd be mad at me if I didn't." That was all. No talk of policy, no mention of orders, no appeal to ideology. Just a mother, a kitchen, a moral instinct carried quietly across an ocean. I wondered then, and this was the thought I did not dare say aloud, whether this kind of America could exist forever, whether the strength that made this possible could survive peace, comfort, distance from hardship. Would people still choose to give when giving was no longer necessary for survival? Would they still recognize cold when it did not threaten them personally? I imagined a future far away from this tent, a future where factories slowed, where families scattered, where memories of shared sacrifice faded into stories told less often with fewer details. Would someone, years from now, see a stranger shivering and respond the same way? Or would they ask questions first? I did not know. All I knew was this. In 1945, at the height of its power and unity, America had chosen to act like this. Not once, but repeatedly. And that repetition had changed me. It had cracked open something I had believed solid and unquestionable. The idea that enemies were always enemies, that kindness was always conditional, that humanity ended where borders began. I was not naive enough to believe this erased the war, or the suffering, or the things done in its name, but it complicated the story. It forced me to carry a truth that did not fit neatly into slogans or flags. That truth was uncomfortable and precious. As winter slowly loosened its grip and the days grew longer, I found myself watching the Americans differently. Not with fear, not even with gratitude, but with a quiet respect. They were not perfect, but they were capable of something rare. They were capable of stopping, even briefly, and choosing mercy when vengeance would have been easier, faster, and more satisfying. That choice did not end the war. But it ended something else. It ended the certainty that cruelty was inevitable. And once that certainty was gone, there was no putting it back. I wrapped my blanket tighter around my shoulders and stood in the fading light, listening to the familiar sounds of the kitchen. The clink of metal, the hiss of water, the murmur of tired voices preparing another meal. Somewhere beyond the trees, the world was still breaking. But here, in this small, ordinary space, something else had taken root. Not ideology, not triumph, but the quiet, dangerous idea that humanity could survive even its worst moments, if people were strong enough to make room for it. And the question that followed me, long after the soup bowls were emptied and the tent lights dimmed, was not one I could answer. It was one I could only carry forward. If they could do this, then, would we still do it now? Some blankets last longer than wars. The war did not end for me with a treaty. It ended quietly years later, in moments that had nothing to do with uniforms or borders. The first time it happened, I was holding the blanket. 30 years had passed. It was winter again, not the brutal, bone-cracking cold of 1945, but a gentler kind, the sort that makes windows frost over and invites people to gather closer together. The blanket had faded by then. The wool was thinner in places, the edges worn soft by time and use. My daughter sat beside me, her legs tucked beneath her, watching as I folded it carefully. "Why do you keep this one?" she asked. I did not answer right away. How do you explain to a child that some objects are heavier than they look, that some warmth comes from memory, not fabric? I told her it was given to me when I was cold. That was enough. 50 years passed. The world changed again. Borders shifted. Flags changed. Old enemies became trading partners, then memories, then footnotes. The war moved from lived experience into history books, simplified, summarized, stripped of its human edges. But the blanket remained. On cold evenings, I wrapped it around my grandchildren as they listened to stories they could barely imagine. I did not tell them about fear first. I did not begin with hunger or bombs or retreat. I told them about soup, about steam rising into frozen air, about butter melting on bread, about hands that shook not from cold, but from relief. They listened quietly, their small fingers tracing the worn wool, their brows furrowed in concentration. "Were they nice to you?" one of them asked once. "Yes," I said. That answer, too, was enough. 70 years passed. By then, I had learned something important. Gratitude does not require forgetting. I did not forget the war. I did not forget the suffering. or the loss, or the terrible things done on all sides. But I also did not forget the Americans who chose differently, not once, but day after day, when it would have been easier not to. Their kindness did not erase history. It complicated it, and that complication mattered. When I met other families, children and grandchildren of German prisoners, I heard the same stories repeated in different words. Not of resentment, not of bitterness, but of surprise, of warmth, of being treated as human when humanity felt scarce. That was the legacy. Not victory, not dominance, but memory carried forward without hatred. And somewhere across the ocean, I imagined American families telling their own stories, of fathers and grandfathers who had cooked in field kitchens, who had shared bread, who had written letters home about strange days when the enemy did not look like an enemy at all. I imagined grandchildren listening and thinking, "My grandfather was like that." That thought mattered, because history remembers battles. It catalogs dates, counts casualties, measures outcomes. But people remember something else entirely. They remember who showed up when it was cold, who gave without asking, who wrapped a stranger in a blanket and did not make it mean more than it needed to. As I grew older, the blanket grew lighter in my hands, not because it weighed less, but because I no longer carried it alone. Its meaning had been passed on, to my children, to my grandchildren, to anyone willing to listen, and perhaps somewhere in America, to families who had never known my name, but recognized the instinct that guided those men all those years ago, the instinct to help first, to ask questions later, or not at all. I do not know what the world will look like when these stories are no longer told by those who lived them. I only know this. On a winter night in 1945, when the world was breaking and cruelty felt inevitable, a group of Americans chose to keep someone warm. That choice outlasted the war. It outlasted borders. It outlasted fear. Some blankets are not just wool. They are promises, and some promises, once made, continue to keep people warm, long after the guns have gone silent. History remembers battles, but people remember who kept them warm.